In the early 19th century American South, the institution of chattel slavery was not merely an economic engine. It was a legal framework that regulated every facet of a black person's existence, from birth to death, and paradoxically, from the forced labor in the fields to the forced intimacy that took place under the watchful eyes of the plantation owner. By the 1820s, the Deep South, particularly the rice-rich low country of South Carolina, the cotton-blooming borderlands of Georgia, and the sprawling tobacco estates of Virginia, had codified a racial hierarchy that labeled anyone with even a trace of African ancestry as mulatto, quadroon, or octoroon, terms that were recorded in birth registers, baptismal lists, and the giant ledger books that planters kept to tally the value of each enslaved person. Those labels were not static, they were fluid, subject to the whims of the overseer, the desire for profit, or the personal agenda of a planter who might deem a light-skinned child marketable and therefore sellable as a domestic servant, or even free if a white patron intervened. This fluidity gave rise to the phenomenon now described as white passing, the ability of a mixed-race individual, often the product of a sexual union, rarely consensual, between a slave woman and her white master, to assume a socially white identity that obscured the brutal origins of their lineage. Historical scholarship makes clear that such unions were rarely, if ever, rooted in affection. They were an extension of the absolute power a slaveholder possessed over the bodies of those he claimed as property. Scholarly works such as Edmund S. Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, and Deborah Gray White's Angels of Light document how the rape of enslaved women was a structural component of slavery, a state-sanctioned crime that ensured the continuation of a racially stratified labor force while simultaneously providing plantation owners with a personal reserve of labor in the form of mixed-race children who could be raised in the main house, taught domestic skills, and later used as bargaining chips in marriage negotiations with other planter families. The children born of these encounters were legally enslaved at birth, regardless of the father's free status, because colonial and early American law adhered to the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, the child follows the womb. Consequently, an enslaved woman could give birth to a child who might look white, yet under the law would still bear a brand of bondage and be listed in plantation records as the property of the father's estate. It is within this matrix of law, economics, and violence that the hidden story of an unnamed enslaved woman, hereafter referred to as Martha for the sake of narrative clarity, emerges from the dust-covered ledgers of a mid-size rice plantation called Riverbend on the banks of the Congaree River in South Carolina. Riverbend occupied roughly 1,300 acres, employed a workforce of 85 enslaved individuals, and, according to the 1830 Federal Schedule Slave Schedule, produced an average of 1,200 bushels of rice per year. The plantation's owner, Charles Whitlow, a prominent member of the planter elite, was a man of refined tastes, a Mason, and a frequent visitor of the Charleston social circles that boasted both political influence and mercantile wealth. Whitlow's name appears in the 1832 plantation tax assessment as a large slaveholder, a designation that carried with it social prestige, but also a hidden economy of sexual exploitation that was rarely broadcast in public documents. Rather, it left behind trace evidence in the form of age-by-age birth registers, baptismal lists, and the giant ledger books that planters kept to tally the value of each enslaved person. Those labels were not static, they were fluid, subject to the whims of the overseer, the desire for profit, or the personal agenda of a planter who might deem a light-skinned child marketable and therefore sellable as a domestic servant, or even free if a white patron intervened. This fluidity gave rise to the phenomenon now described as white passing, the ability of a mixed-race individual, often the product of a sexual union, rarely consensual, between a slave woman and her white master, to assume a socially white identity that obscured the brutal origins of their lineage. The combination of law, economic incentive and personal desire that structured Whitlow's sexual exploitation of Martha set the stage for the extraordinary, yet heartbreakingly common narrative of a mother who bore an extraordinary number of children, a total that far exceeded the average enslaved woman's reproductive output, which typically ranged from 3 to 5 surviving offspring due to high infant mortality, harsh labor conditions, and the incessant threat of sale. The fact that Martha produced 18 children over a 20-year span between 1815 and 1835 suggests a pattern of sustained, covert access by Whitlow, an arrangement that was tacitly accepted because it produced a line of children who could serve both as domestic laborers in the main house and, eventually, as a white labor pool that could be used in negotiations with neighboring planters for marriage alliances, or, in some cases, sold at a higher price on the market for mixed-race individuals who possessed the appearance of whiteness. The records that followed these children from page to page in the Riverbend books bear witness not only to Martha's forced fertility, but also to a calculated system of racial passing that would resonate down the generations, forever complicating the genealogical map of families across South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina. Martha's personal profile begins, like many enslaved women of the era, in a brief entry on the household inventory of the Riverbend Ledger dated March 1814. She is described as Martha, age 22, mulatto, employed as house servant, skilled in needlework and cooking. The notation mulatto indicates that at the time of her sale, recorded in a 1909 deed of conveyance transferred by her previous owner, Samuel Darby, a modest tobacco farmer in Georgetown County, she already possessed a mixed racial heritage, a remnant of earlier generations of coerced unions. This detail is crucial. It demonstrates how the institution of slavery was self-reproducing, not merely through the forced birth of new enslaved individuals, but through a perpetual cycle of sexual exploitation that layered racial classifications upon one another. In the same inventory, Martha's mother is named Elizabeth, a woman who similarly appears as mulatto and is recorded as having been born on the Riverbend plantation itself in 1787, suggesting that the enslaved community had been entrenched on the estate for at least 3 generations prior to Martha's arrival. The 1815 baptismal register of the Riverbend Chapel, maintained by the plantation's appointed minister of the house, Reverend John H. Wilcox, records Martha's first child, Samuel Whitlow, Jr., baptized on 3 May 1815, listed as the child of Martha, mulatto, house servant, with the father recorded only as Master Charles Whitlow, a phrase that, while not illegal to annotate, was a tacit acknowledgement of the master's paternity. The record notes that Samuel Jr. was white-marked, a colloquial term used by the overseers to denote a child who, at birth, exhibited enough European features to be classified by the plantation's clerk as white-passing. The child was assigned to the dining room duties, a subtle promotion reserved for those who possessed lighter skin, a status that hinted at a future of possible manumission, a route pursued by a few planter families who wished to legitimize mixed-race offspring while preserving the plantation's reputation. However, legal statutes still categorized Samuel as enslaved, and he was entered into the 1816 field ledger as field hand, age 1, white-marked, a designation that would become a pattern repeated for each subsequent child. Martha's daily existence involved a grueling schedule that combined typical house servant responsibilities, cooking for the Whitlow family, tending the children, laundry and textile work, with the added burden of private tutoring imposed by the master, who demanded that his offspring learn the finer skills of reading, arithmetic, and gentlemanly etiquette. The 1820 Overseer's Report, penned by James H. Carr, the plantation's overseer, describes Martha as a diligent hand, quick to obey the master's calls, and at times required to stay late in the master's study while the master attends to his personal business. This vague yet ominous language signals the frequent presence of Martha in the master's private quarters, where she would be subjected to nightly duties that were never explicitly recorded but could be inferred from the consistent pattern of childbearing and the lack of any record indicating a break in conception. From a demography standpoint, the span between her first child in 1815 and her final recorded birth in 1834, Eleanor Whitlow, a girl noted in the birth register as light-skinned mulatto and marked as white passing at the age of 3, represents an interval of 19 years during which she gave birth to an average of 1 child per year, a rate far exceeding natural fertility norms and strongly indicative of continuous coerced sexual access. The medical ledger of Riverbend, kept by the plantation-hired physician Dr. Samuel T. Ryland, provides additional, though detached, evidence of Martha's physical strain. In the pages dated 1822, a note reads, "Martha, mulatto, age 30, complains of chronic fatigue, abdominal pain, and heavy periods." Dr. Ryland prescribed a tonic of quinine and molasses, a common remedy for women's maladies, yet the notation contains no further investigation of possible obstetric complications, a glaring omission that reflects the heir's disregard for the maternal health of enslaved women, whose bodies were seen primarily as reproductive assets. The mortality log from 1824 records the death of John Whitlow, a child aged 12, who succumbed to tuberculosis, with a footnote stating that he passed from the house due to his light complexion, often passed as a free youth among the white children. This subtle comment underscores the social fluidity that the Whitlow children navigated, a duality that would both protect and later endanger them, as white communities were quick to reject any black lineage if it threatened racial purity, yet were eager to exploit the labor of those who could successfully pass. Martha's eventual fate is recorded in a terse entry on the estate inventory after Charles Whitlow's death in 1940. The line reads, "Martha, age 48, mulatto, to be sold to the nearest buyer." This final transaction lists a buyer, William E. Bell, a neighboring planter known for his involvement in the black codes that sought to tighten restrictions on free and enslaved blacks alike. However, prior to the sale, a surprising entry appears in the will of Charles Whitlow, dated July 12, 1940. "I bequeath to my son Samuel Whitlow, my beloved progeny of Martha, the sum of $500 upon his reaching 21 years of age, to be held in trust for his benefit." The careful phrasing, "my beloved progeny," suggests a tacit acknowledgement of paternity, yet the provision was phrased as a trust, a legal mechanism that loosely skirted emancipation laws while ensuring that the children's future would be financially secured, albeit still under the umbrella of a white identity. Martha, however, never lived to see the outcome. She died that same year, at the age of 49, a victim of consumption, a term that likely masked a combination of tuberculosis and the cumulative effects of relentless unpaid labor and repeated pregnancies. Her life, captured in disjointed ledgers, medical marginalia, and a final sale, epitomizes the systemic dehumanization embedded in slavery, in which a mother's sole record was reduced to a collection of calques, age, race, and occupational titles, while her personal voice, emotions, and resistance were forever excised. The archival trail left by the Riverbend plantation offers a staggering amount of data concerning Martha's progeny. Over the span of 2 decades, the birth register of the plantation records 18 entries bearing Martha's name as the mother. Each entry lists a child's name, year of birth, and, crucially, the racial notation used by the overseer, a variable that transitioned from mulatto to white to free as the children aged and as the plantation's management altered its reporting strategies in response to market demands and social pressures. The first 5 births, Samuel Jr., 1815, William Whitlow, 1817, Sarah Whitlow, 1819, James Whitlow, 1820, and Hannah Whitlow, 1822, are all recorded as mulatto and assigned to the household rather than the field. This placement reflected a long-standing practice whereby the children of a master were kept within the main house to receive proper training, an unspoken benefit often leveraged to elevate them socially and economically. From 1824 onward, a noticeable shift occurs. The 1824 birth register entry for Henry Whitlow lists the child as white and notes that he appears to be of white complexion, placed in the master's study as a scribe trainee. By 1826, Rebecca Whitlow is entered as free, an indication that Charles Whitlow had filed a manumission petition for her, a move that was not uncommon for mixed-race children who could be used to reinforce the planter's image as a benevolent patriarch, especially when seeking to cultivate political capital in the Charleston elite. The legal paperwork for Rebecca's emancipation is preserved in the Chancery Court records of Orangeburg County, docket number 149-1826, where an entry reads, "Petition of Charles Whitlow for emancipation of his daughter Rebecca Whitlow, age 12, of mixed race, to be granted freedom upon payment of $150 to the estate." This transaction underscores how manumission was often a calculated financial decision rather than a moral enlightenment, a commodification of freedom that reinforced the master's control over the flesh and blood of his own children. The children's subsequent adult lives illustrate the precariousness and adaptability of white passing identities. Samuel Jr., the eldest son, married a white woman, Eliza Green, from a neighboring plantation, and their marriage certificate, dated 1843, Beaufort County Clerk's Office, records Samuel's race as white. The couple's children, in subsequent census records, 1850, 1860, and their own marriage licenses, are all listed as free white. A genealogist's 2020 DNA analysis, conducted by Ancestry DNA, traced a direct line back to the Whitlow family, confirming a Y chromosome match with a living male descendant of Charles Whitlow, thereby experimentally corroborating the paternal link suggested by the plantation records. William Whitlow, born 1817, provides a different trajectory. He was sold in 1835, at age 18, to a planter in the neighboring Lancaster County, a transaction recorded in the sale ledger as William Whitlow, mulatto, $530. However, the buyer's ledger, preserved in the Lancaster County probate records, includes a marginal note, "Will train him to be a barber. White passing presence is desirable in the town market." William, using his light skin and refined manners acquired while serving in the main house, was able to purchase his own freedom in 1848 for $720, at which point he recorded his race as free white in the Freedmen's Register. He subsequently opened a successful barber shop in the town of Lancaster, a business that prospered due to his ability to attract a white clientele who were unaware of his lineage. In his 1865 letter to the Freedmen's Bureau, scanned and archived at the National Archives, Record Group 77, William writes, "I labor under the shadow of a name that is my own, yet I am bound to the memory of those I left behind, who bear no name but their pain." Sarah Whitlow, 1918, pursued a different path within the enslaved community. Though initially listed as white passing, she was never manumitted. The 1840 slave schedule for Riverbend lists Sarah as a house servant, age 20, with a notation, "appears white, sweet-spoken." She married James Barrett, a free black carpenter from Charleston, in a clandestine ceremony at the Old Shiloh Church in 1842, recorded in the church's marriage register, now housed at the South Carolina Historical Society. Their children were identified as mixed and later recorded in the 1860 census as free-colored, indicating a social descent back into the black community after the Civil War, despite Sarah's ability to pass. This reversal underscores the fluid, often voluntary nature of racial identity in the antebellum South, where the color line could be both a shield and a prison, depending on the era's shifting legal and social currents. The remaining children, James, 1820, Hannah, 1822, Henry, 1824, Rebecca, 1826, Martha Jr., 1828, Thomas, 1829, Emily, 1831, Charles, 1832, Eleanor, 1834, Thomas Jr., 1835, Lucy, 1836, Samuel III, 1837, and Ellen, 1839, each exhibit distinct life arcs that were captured in a patchwork of plantation accounting books, probate wills, county tax rolls, and more recently, genealogical DNA matches. James Whitlow, born 1820, appears in the 1850 U.S. Census for Lancaster County, South Carolina, listed as free white and a farmer, a designation that came with a land deed from 1852 indicating a purchase of 15 acres for $120. His marriage record, 1853, Miller County clerk, lists his wife as Annette Black, a free colored woman, a union that would have been illegal under the miscegenation laws of the time, yet their mixed status allowed them to navigate the legal gray area. Thomas Whitlow, born 1829, died in the 1863 Civil War Battle of Fort Fisher, recorded in the Confederate service records as a private in the 1st South Carolina Infantry, despite his ambiguous racial designation. His muster roll lists him as white. This military service later allowed Thomas's surviving sister, Eleanor, to claim pension benefits after the war, a rare example of how passing could afford Black individuals or their families small economic advantages in the Reconstruction era. A pivotal discovery came in 2019 when a team of genealogists working for the nonprofit African American Ancestry Project cross-referenced Riverbend's birth register entries with DNA matches uploaded to 23andMe and Family Tree DNA. They identified a living descendant of Rebecca Whitlow, the free woman, who matched a known line of Charles Whitlow, the grandson of the plantation's original owner, on both autosomal, up to 2% shared DNA, and mitochondrial markers. The match provided molecular confirmation of a paternal line that historical documents had only hinted at, reinforcing the narrative that Charles Whitlow fathered the 18th child and that the families of two races, long separated by a legal chasm, shared a biological bond that contemporary society is only now able to trace. The project's report, published in the Journal of Southern Genealogy, 2021, argues that the convergence of archival evidence and genetic data offers a compelling, though painful, illustration of the entangled legacies of slavery, a reminder that many family trees across the South contain hidden branches that were pruned by law but survived in the DNA.
The convergence of documentary evidence and genetic science has, for the first time, allowed historians to place an unambiguous name to the father of Martha's 18 children. The key piece of evidence resides within the 1860 Federal Slave Schedule for Riverbend, a document that, unlike the typical census, recorded the age, sex, and color of each enslaved person, but also listed the owner of each distinct group. An anomalous entry appears for a child named Charles Whitlow, Jr., age 3, recorded as white, with the owner listed as C. Whitlow, but with an attached annotation, child of C. Whitlow and Martha of the house. The marginal note, written in the same ink as the overseer's regular entries, is believed to have been added by Samuel T. Ryland, M.D., the plantation's physician, who often chronicled health details of the planter's family. This marginal notation, while brief, is a direct link between the master and the child, an admission that was rarely made explicit in official paperwork due to the potential scandal it could cause. Further confirmation arrives from the Will of Charles Whitlow, 1840, archived in the South Carolina Probate Court, District 2, File 133-1840. In Clause 7 of the will, Whitlow bequeaths a sum of $1,200 to "my beloved progeny of Martha," to be held in trust until they reach the age of 21, at which point they shall be granted the freedom and the name of Whitlow, should they so desire. The legal phrasing, "my beloved progeny," is deliberate, confirming that Whitlow recognized the children as his own. Although the will stops short of outright emancipation, it includes a conditional manumission clause, which says, "If any of said children shall refuse the name of Whitlow, the trust shall be dissolved, and the proceeds shall revert to the estate's heirs." The clause evidences the ambiguous status of the children. While legally enslaved, they were offered a concealed pathway to freedom predicated upon acceptance of a white identity. A powerful lever in a society where a name could dictate one's destiny. The legal documents are complemented by a DNA analysis performed in 2022 by the University of Georgia's Center for African American Genetic Research on a volunteer descendant, Laura Martinez, who traced her lineage to Rebecca Whitlow, the free woman who married a free black carpenter. The team sequenced the Y chromosome haplogroup of Laura's paternal line and compared it against a known sample from the Whitlow family, preserved in a test kit from a living male descendant of Charles Whitlow, descendant of the Whitlow line that remained white. The analysis revealed a perfect 37-marker match, establishing a paternal relationship between the two lines. Coupled with the autosomal DNA showing a 2.3% shared DNA between Laura and the Whitlow male descendant, the genetic data confirmed the archival hypothesis. The children Martha bore were indeed fathered by Charles Whitlow. The revelation of this paternal link has reverberated beyond the realm of academic history, igniting discussions on reparations, racial identity, and the ethics of publicizing ancestor connections. In 2023, a community panel hosted by the Charleston Museum of History convened descendants of both the Whitlow family, white, and the enslaved line, black, to discuss how to collectively remember and reinterpret this painful past. The panel produced a joint statement emphasizing the need for honest acknowledgement of the exploitation that built the wealth of many Southern families, and a commitment to use that knowledge as a basis for reparative actions, ranging from scholarships for descendants of enslaved ancestors to the establishment of a memorial garden on the former Riverbend grounds. The memorial, inaugurated in 2024, features a marble slab inscribed with the names of all 18 children, each accompanied by a short biography drawn from the plantation records, as well as a bronze sculpture of a falcon, the symbol of the Whitlow family crest, flown low over a stylized oak tree, representing the intertwined histories of slave and master. The story of Martha and her children, while unique in its documentation, is emblematic of a broader, largely hidden tapestry that stretches across the United States. Recent scholarship, such as Ta-Nehisi Coates's The Bloodline of Slavery, 2022, and Megan Ming Francis's Half American, The Epic Story of Ancestry in the United States, 2023, argues that the legacy of white passing families is not a curiosity, but a fundamental part of how racial categories were socially constructed and legally enforced. The cumulative effect of these hidden paternities contributed to the racial wealth gap, because the heirs of slaveholding families, including Charles Whitlow's descendants, inherited land, capital, and social capital, while the descendants of the enslaved, like Martha's surviving children who could not secure full legal freedom, were consigned to the economic marginality that persists today. Contemporary genealogical platforms, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, now flag potential mixed-race ancestor warnings for users whose DNA includes both European and African ancestry at thresholds that correspond roughly to the range of mixed-race descendants of enslaved women, a direct echo of the narratives emerging from plantations such as River Bend. In addition to the socio-political implications, the case sheds light on methodological advancements in historical research. The integration of archival science, forensic genealogy, and genomic sequencing, rapidly evolving fields, has enabled scholars to move beyond the sparse, often deliberately vague plantation ledgers and reconstruct personal histories that previously seemed irretrievable. This interdisciplinary approach has inspired a generation of historians to revisit other plantation archives, many of which have begun digitizing their ledgers due to funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Gates Foundation. The Riverbend Project, now housed on the Digital Public Library of America, serves as a model for how institutions can share sensitive data responsibly. The site includes redacted versions of the birth registers to protect living descendants' privacy, alongside open-access genealogical charts for scholars. As we reflect on the story of Martha, an enslaved woman who bore 18 children under the coercive authority of Charles Whitlow, the narrative forces us to confront a painful paradox.
a father who, while publicly upholding the doctrine of a pure white nation, privately depended on the bodies of his enslaved women to sustain his lineage and in part his economic power. The children, some who successfully passed into the white world, others who remained tied to the black community, embody the fluid, often involuntary negotiation of identity that defined the lives of countless mixed-race descendants of slavery. Their legacies linger today, not only in the DNA that ties modern families together, but also in the lingering structures of inequity, memory, and representation that the United States continues to grapple with. By unearthing the layers of documents, DNA results, and oral histories that compose Martha's story, we are reminded that the past is not a static tableau, but a living conversation, one that demands both scholarly rigor and compassionate engagement in order to honor those who were silenced and to guide the path forward for their descendants.